Okay, here we go, you all. Good morning. It is 10 o'clock. I'm in my lab at State Fair Community College. Just got done talking about blood and the heart to the anatomy students. We're going to do kidneys at 11 with physiology. And for you all, we're going to continue on our deep dive into the obesity code. So now we talked about dairy protein yesterday. Today we're going to talk about red meat. So the low carb people think Atkins. Um, Basically, they faced the red meat dilemma. So meat is supposed to be non-fattening because it's low carb. It's not a carbohydrate at all, right? So some large studies kind of question that. Okay, is that really true? So there is a study, and I put the graph a couple hours ago from this study called Changes in Diet and Lifestyle and Long-Term Weight Gain in Women and Men. Okay, so it's a fairly large correlation between red meat and obesity, believe it or not. So since proteins can be equally as stimulating to insulin release, meat's not nearly as benign as the Atkins people actually thought so. So the Atkins people changed from Atkins diet diet revolution number 1 to 2.0 in the early 2000s. Instead of the original, which was low carb and high fat, this one was low carb and high protein. Okay, so the results of the Atkins devotees, though, is reinforced in the trial results of this study. So millions of dieters in the late 90s, early 2000s were doing the low carb, high protein Atkins 2.0 approach. And for quite a few that worked, but for many more it didn't deliver the weight loss that was promised. And so the popularity of that second phase of Atkins diet kind of waned and it's kind of gone away. And then another interesting part of that study looked at exercise. So I've told you counting calories doesn't work, exercise doesn't work. So overall, there's a beneficial of exercise, at least in this study on weight gain. You should exercise not to lose weight. You should exercise just because it's good for you. So if you break down each of the groups in this study to quintiles, so 20th percentile, 40th percentile, 60th percentile, within each dietary group, there was a benefit for those that did more exercise. But it's much less beneficial to change on weight loss to changes in the diet. Okay, so that doesn't seem to be new either. So the overwhelmingly important factor in weight gain is what you're eating. Exercise is secondary. So the risk of type 2 diabetes in this study, closely related to obesity, was also examined, specifically looking at red meat consumption. So there's another cohort of another cohort from this particular, or another study from this cohort called red meat consumption and risk of type 2 diabetes. And so 3 cohorts of U.S. adults in an updated meta-analysis. So analyzing the results separately for processed and unprocessed meat, there was a pretty good correlation between diabetes and both types. So the hazard ratio, 1.19 for 100 grams of unprocessed red meat, so natural meat, compared to 1.5 for 50 grams of processed meat, so it wasn't quite the same weight. So processed meats were worse over the long run. So that means for every extra 100 grams of unprocessed meat like steak, pork chops, there's a 20% increase in the risk of diabetes. And then for every extra 50 grams of processed meat, so lunch meat, bacon, there's a 50% increase in the risk of diabetes. So once again, just like we saw in the carbohydrate lesson, it's the processing that's the problem. So it's not technically the food itself, it's how it's processed. So a bunch of other studies have shown a difference between processed and unprocessed meats as well. There's a review called Red and Processed Meat Consumption and Risk of Incident Coronary heart disease, stroke, and diabetes. That was a systematic review. There was no association between unprocessed meats and diabetes, heart disease, or stroke in that large study, but a 42% increased risk of heart attack, diabetes, and stroke for those eating processed meats. Okay. A large European experience and study was published called Meat Consumption and Mortality, results from the European Prospective Investigation into Cancer and Nutrition. And so increased mortality and cancer risk was seen predominantly with meats that had been processed. The effect was much weaker in unprocessed meats and did not reach statistical significance. So there's another blow to the Atkins diet. So the advice from that to skip bread and eat all the bacon you want was apparently not as good as they thought. Sausages, lunch meat, bacon, and other processed meats were not a whole lot better than the processed carbohydrates that they were meant to replace. So once again, the toxicity seems to be in the processing. So we have evolved to eat many different types of foods without health problems. So there were some ancestral diets, so like the Inuit people of Alaska, high in meat and fats. There's the Kitavans and the Okinawans, heavily carbohydrate dependent with rice. But both traditional diets were associated with good health, and until recently, the Okinawans had the longest lifespan on Earth. But neither one of those diets have processed food. They're using unprocessed food. So then, so looking at the hormonal effect on obesity, you can add the effect of animal protein to the protein raising effect. And there's also protective effects of protein. So remember, protein stimulates insulin secretion, but it also reduces stomach emptying, so it slows gastric motility. So consider the macronutrients. Both protein and carbohydrates stimulate insulin to varying degrees. Dietary fats have the least effect on insulin. However, over the past 4 decades, because of nutritional advice, we've reduced our intake of dietary fats, natural ones. So that left you with increasing proteins and carbohydrates in the diet. So pretty much no matter what you do, if you follow that advice, you're probably going to fail. Morning, Linda. So then the confusion of the calories. So all macronutrients basically have been shown to be the same. We imagine that all foods, regardless of nutritional content, could be measured in a common unit called the calorie. So initially, 1977, low-fat, high-carbohydrate diet was recommended. When that failed, the Atkins approach of low-fat, high-protein was tried. That failed as well. So really, there's kind of confusion and maybe some difficulty on the framework to understand the etiology of obesity and type 2 diabetes. So both proteins and carbohydrates come with some protective factors. With carbohydrates, if they're unprocessed, you have fiber, which does kind of the same thing that protein does. So unprocessed carbohydrates, lots of dietary fiber, and traditional societies would eat 50 to 100 grams of fiber a day through their carbohydrates. But the standard North American diet, where processing removes the fiber, the actual fiber intake in the standard American diet is only 15 grams compared to 50 to 100 grams in years gone past. So with dietary proteins, we're protected by the incretin effect of hormones from the fundus of the stomach, and then slowing of gastric motility. And then dietary protein increases the signals to your hypothalamus to tell you that you're full and you eat less at your next meal. So in years past, large meals full of protein would be followed by long periods of fasting in order to digest, rest and digest. And to a fairly large extent in this country, that doesn't happen anymore. Okay? So you can eat a large meal like Thanksgiving, but everybody's paranoid to skip the next one because you irrationally fear that the next meal will wreck your missing the next meal will wreck your metabolism, and everything would be screwed up. So you see this in children. They don't eat if they're not hungry. They won't eat. If you try to feed a child that's not hungry, they just won't do it. Wild animals do the same thing. Lions and tigers and bears don't eat unless they're hungry. But here in this country, as we've gotten more civilized, I guess, we ignore our own feelings of satiety. So you eat when the time comes, whether you're hungry or not. So you're circumventing the protective effect of the incretins by scheduling 3 meals a day, whether you want them or not. You may not be hungry, but most people will eat. So there's really no bad foods unless you're talking about processing. The further you stray from real food, the more danger you get into. So should you eat protein bars? Probably not if you look at what's in them. What about meal replacements? Should you drink meal replacement shakes? Should you avoid processed meats and carbohydrates? To an extent, you should. So it's difficult to remove all of these from our diets in this country. So we've developed over the centuries other dietary strategies to detoxify or cleanse our bodies. And those strategies have been pretty much lost, and most of them have to do with not eating if you're not hungry. So we'll get to that coming down the road. So today we're doing red meats and the red meat dilemma. Okay, so meat was supposed to be non-fattening because it's not a carbohydrate. We went through some studies that showed that that's not exactly true. The Atkins diet people kind of reinforce the trial results that I'm showing you. And then another interesting tidbit from that study was the utility of exercise. So there was some benefit to more exercise, but not as much as changes in diet. So the risk of type 2 diabetes, that's kind of reviewing the whole thing, the toxicity and the processing, risk of type 2 diabetes, etc. So really, we'll continue to look at this from different classes of macronutrients. So we're coming up on fat. We haven't gone through natural fat yet. We've done dairy protein. We've done the carbohydrates. Now we've done proteins and compared to dairy proteins and red meat proteins. And overall, we're trying to search for why is it that people get obese? What's the etiology of obesity? That's the whole point of this class and this part of this series that I'm doing in this class. So we're going to continue to explore tomorrow, and we'll wind up looking at the benefits of vinegar tomorrow. And I'll tell you a story about a 104-year-old woman that I met in Humansville, Missouri years ago, and what she did to get to that ripe age of 104. So have a great day. It's beautiful here. I've got to teach physiology in 45 minutes. This is a quicker class than most of them. Got it done in about 15 minutes, 13 minutes. And I will talk to you tomorrow, probably 9:30 Central Time, back at the dining room. So see you later. Bye. Have a good day. Bye.